Okay, looks like we are finally live this morning. And welcome back to Mission Top, everyone. Mission Top is a place, it's a farmstead and ranch. It is a family, my family. My name is Gary Nuila. It is a process, it is a way of life. It is a family trying to live out this way of life, have successes, have failures, and report back in what we learn in the process. And today, I was a little bit late getting onto this stream, a little bit behind the times. Kind of my general process in getting ready for these streams is I'll come up with a topic and I'll start working the best I can to get a coherent stream of thoughts together. So, because my most general fear is that I'll say something foolish. And so when we're dealing with COVID, with the increased stakes of offending, of saying something that creates ire or problems. Of course, this morning I was a little bit more aware and acute in that kind of process of trying to ensure that nothing stupid or foolish would be said this morning, and hopefully only helpful things. So I've tried to approach this in a way that I am saying something that I haven't been seen said out in the open much, but at the same time isn't something that is condemnatory, let's say. So I'm feeling at least pretty good on that fact, is that there's not much condemnation in this. And my hope is that by the end, no matter what somebody's kind of inclinations or leanings towards kind of the whole COVID phenomenon is, especially from a political standpoint, that people will be able to say, okay, yeah, that's a good point about that. And then also see a course of action, something to do about it. Because if anything, I don't want to just present problems out there into the world without solutions. If I ever am presenting problems or fundamental issues, then I'm also trying to present something that people can do about it, especially you kind of common people, such as I imagine you are and as I certainly am. So that's the efforts with this. But also the effort at the same time, and one of the things that I love to do with any issue is really to try to dig into what is the fundamental problem. Try to get as far underneath an issue or a problem as I can. And so that is the efforts on this. And usually it ends up in something more, a lot of people would term philosophical, but we're going to get exactly into that point. What is philosophy actually? What was it? What did it start out as? What has it become? What could it be in your own life? So that is going to have everything to do with what we are talking about today. So let's start out with an observation that will kind of frame this whole discussion around COVID. And the main point I want to make initially is to show how we have fractured the world around us. Okay? So for the longest time, going back hundreds of years now, and in many ways even thousands, we as humanity have engaged in this process of fracturing the world, of dividing it up, okay? Of categorizing it into ever smaller little bits and pieces. You look back at the ancient world and you see, kind of the farther back you go, the less and less of this that you see, okay? Even just several hundred years ago, there weren't as stark divisions between things like politics and religion and science and economics and agriculture and art. We kind of see those as pretty heavy divisions, and people should be in one or the other, or look at things from one or another of these divisions, okay? But you look back at the way people used to act, and all these things were kind of just one thing, Your science had to do anything that was even engaged in kind of a scientific process of trying to understand how the world works was bound up with religion, was bound up with agriculture. There weren't these things, these different ways of seeing things in different disciplines. Although even for thousands of years, of course there have been different, categories and ways of looking at things, but not nearly as stark as today. Okay, there was mainly just the world and your ability to act in it. And so you brought everything into the fray, your understanding of the entire world in order to try to understand it and act in it, okay? then along the way, we started developing further and further abilities on how to carve up the world, right? Categorize it, and then focus in on these categories and ever smaller bits of the world. And doing this has made us tremendously powerful, right? This is the basis of the scientific method, the way that we focus in on just a little point of reality and try to isolate all the other variables so we can just focus in on this and add different little circumstances to that variable and see what happens and do it in a way that other people can copy that method. That's the scientific method. And of course, that's made us tremendously powerful. It's helped us to flourish as a species. It's done us a lot of good. But in that process, we now have experts in so many fields. And these experts can get down to very, minute little corners of the world and know an incredible amount about them. I mean, for example, if you're a PhD student today, you're not only in some general discipline, you're usually kind of focused in some sub-discipline of a discipline, some small period of history that you might be looking at. And then when you do your PhD, you're supposed to read everything that's ever been said about this small section of what you're focusing on. And you might be able to add, just a little bit more to the general understanding of knowledge, the overall giant body of knowledge. And you did your little part in this, microscopic little speck of area of the world in your PhD, and that's how we kind of have proceeded in the world. So every time we have a problem, we try to identify, who's that expert? Who's that PhD that wrote their dissertation on exactly this? Let's get them out there. Let's interview them. Let's see what they have to say on this. Or if it's a scientific pursuit, get the scientist that is specialized in just this kind of thing in order to help us solve this problem. We even focus our work on these kind of minute specialties, right? If you're in a company, you're generally working on some specialized thing. If you're a lawyer, you have only these specialized area of practices. There's not as many general practitioners, even within disciplines today. We have a lot of specialists. And, the kind of quintessential example of the past of how you'd have to be a generalist would be someone living on a farmstead or a homestead, just like I am now, where you have to be able to look across multiple disciplines at once, across various disciplines of science, practical disciplines of just how to, manage your time, plan ahead, read the seasons, handle a staff of people, whether it's your family or otherwise. Understand the anatomy of various kinds of animals, but also know a lot about botany and biology and all these things. But of course, nobody looked at it in that way. It was just all this body of knowledge that you would need in order to run this generalized effort that you were pursuing. And a lot of people were doing that, right? And so we had a lot of generalists around. And so today, our knowledge as a result of this, just like I was pointing out with the PhD, and the way that we categorize in and zoom in on things and produce a little bit more knowledge has increased the overall body of knowledge exponentially, right? And you can see we've even done this at the level of our identities. And so there is this general trend of fracturing and dividing within society itself. We have it seems like every few months, some new specialized identity comes out as to the way somebody carves up who they are and what they're kind of putting at the forefront of how they identify themselves, right? And as it continues on, and you get every new kind of acronym to add into the various list of identities, you start realizing, there's no end to this, right? Because as it turns out, there are infinite ways that you can carve up the world, okay? Whether in a scientific sense, whether in a sense of identifying who you are in your identity, it never ends, right? You can carve up forever. And so you start to see that although this is powerful, it can bring great power, there's also something fraught in it because it's a never-ending process. And if you end up carving up everything forever, well, it turns out that reality, it's a pretty infinite space out there that you could keep on trying to carve up forever. But it turns out that a lot of times you need to be able to pull things together, right? You need to be able to see what parts of reality are important to focus in on at once and not just be brought to whatever it may be. You have to know what's relevant, right? Relevance is probably the key word here. You have to be able to know what's relevant. Relevant for what? In order to know how to act, right? And what are you doing in order to act? In order to act and achieve something that you want to achieve. And there's another thing you have to know in this. There's infinite things you could do. What should you do, right? What's the valuable use of your time? These are all questions that like an ever fracturing way of looking at the world can't really answer, okay? So as we've gotten powerful in this process, then along comes an event like COVID. And immediately we try to figure out, okay, what kind of event is this, right? Is it a medical event? Yeah, it seems like it is, right? Is it a public health event? Okay, yes, we'll start getting in those experts. We need our public health people. We need our disease, epidemiologists and all these things. Start gathering them in. What kind of event is this? Then we start realizing, oh, actually, is this an economic event? Well, yeah, it's starting to affect things economically. We'll get in the economists. We need to know what to do. And then we start realizing, oh, is it a psychological event as well? People are starting to be affected as to the way they feel about the world, their mental health. Okay, we need those people as well. And then it starts, striking down to the very kind of fundamental levels of society. Is this a religious event? Well, yeah, a lot of people are seeing it in religious terms. Certainly it's a political event because it's come to shape people's political leanings and inclinations all have to do with these things. So you start seeing that, like, what is COVID? What kind of event is it? We're trying to find the experts that can help give us the answers that we need to in order to face this event. What specialty does it belong in? Where's the person that can handle this event, can give us the course forward, and tell us, essentially during this event, who are we, right? And what level should we act at in handling this event? And in fact, how do we want to handle? What should we care about? What should we be doing with this event of COVID, okay? And as you've noticed, the answers coming to that aren't so easy because, as it turns out, there isn't such a person that is prepared to handle an event like this, okay? And so what do? We default to at least the experts that make the most sense to us, and hence we get Dr. Fauci, Oh, Dr. Fauci knows. And so he's held up. I mean, people have made like murals of him and, he's kind of held out like this figure, like he can guide us through this, Very quickly, many people are saying, okay, Donald Trump doesn't seem like he's going to give us anything helpful on this, but Dr. Fauci, at least we've got him. He's a doctor. He seems to know what he's talking about in terms of, viruses and diseases. So therefore, here we've got somebody that can handle this, okay? And so we rely on these people to tell us what we should care about in this, what we should do. Thank goodness we had Dr. Fauci to tell us, what we should do day to day. What should I, should I be locked down? Should I be wearing a mask? Should I not? Tell me what to do. I need to know what to do during this event, okay? But the problem with all this is that, for example, our kind of default in our heart today, because we value it so much, has been to rely on the scientists, for example. The scientists can get us through this. They know the answers. Science, we can, as in The Martian said, we can science the heck out of this, right? Different swear word or whatever, but that's how we're going to approach this, and it can tell us what to do. But when you start thinking about it, and I brought this up before in whole streams, science actually can't tell you what to do. That's the thing that it can't tell you what to do, because science doesn't deal with the realm of values, what's more important and what's less important, right? It can only tell you what to do once you've identified what's actually important, what you want to focus on, what your goals are, okay? But it can't tell you your goals. But we can very easily get deceived that it can. Dr. Fauci, tell us what our goals should be, But it turns out goals are much more lie in much broader disciplines of what's actually important for human flourishing and what's not. And again, science can't tell you that. It can only tell you what to study if you have other goals and other ideas of how you want to get information about human flourishing once you've even identified what human flourishing is, right? But in that deception of thinking science can give us that, then there's almost always a default of what science tells us should be our goal in the process. And it's the very one that I brought out when talking about the movie Interstellar. Since science can't tell you exactly what to default, there is at least one scientific theory that kind of identifies that at least what for human beings is the most important thing, and that's the theory of evolution. And what we generally get out of science is this feeling like, okay, well, at least we know one thing that's important: life. Preserve life, get life to continue. And so that generally becomes the default position. And notice that with COVID, that has become the default position. Preserve the most life possible. And so everything is acted from a certain point on from that standpoint. And it kind of happened by degrees. At first that wasn't the focus. At first the focus was, slow the spread of the disease, right? And then it was try to not let people die from this. And then it became, well, let's not try to have anyone get this disease at all. But it just kind of happened in there. Like, who made that decision? And who was valuing which one of those things was more important? Again, somebody did, and we just kind of defaulted to hoping that they were going to get it right. But again, I'm trying to argue, whoever was making the decisions was a specialist, was most likely a scientist that had a very particular training and actually hadn't been prepared in life to make the determinations of what is most important in a society when a society is experiencing an event that crosses over literally all the domains of a society, okay? And so, again, like I said, we defaulted to, okay, preserve as much life as we can and do everything we can in order to do that. And so we did. We lock everyone down. We have, anything that shows any possibility of preserving life, we must do that. And we must do it in many places, even by force, okay? This must be done. Everybody has to do it or else it won't work. We have to preserve life. That's the fundamental value. Let's proceed. But if you think about it, for a couple seconds, and you ask yourself, that sounds nice, like that preserving life should be the fundamental value always. But if you think about it for just 2 seconds, you'll notice that in society, it's all the time. It's all the time that we do things that we know will take life, right? Why? Because we know that there's higher values than just preserving all life in all situations possible. Okay, and here's two very simple examples of that. Right? One would be driving. Okay, we know that by people driving on the roads, there will be life lost. Okay, there will be a significant amount of life lost, but we have determined as a society there's a higher value, and that is the mobility of people and goods. And so we tolerate this loss of life, even though we could prevent it, because we want the other thing. And you could argue, well, that's only because more life will be preserved by having this flow of goods, being able to get food and medicine to different places. It's like, okay, all right, fair enough. So maybe that's the value. We're willing to give up some lives for a greater amount of life, right? Well, how about something like swimming? Okay, we let people swim. It turns out swimming, when you compare it to many activities, is actually quite dangerous, and people lose their life around in our society all the time, okay? And I don't think by letting people swim, it preserves more life. Like, maybe you could make the argument that when people are swimming, they get better swimmers, and then when people fall by accident into pools or lakes or oceans, since people know how to swim, it will preserve overall life. But that's not how we frame it at all. We let people swim because people like to swim, and it's a value to enjoying going and swimming. That's why we do it. And we know that some people will die in that process. There's always that risk, and yet we do it anyway, okay? So all I'm trying to illustrate here is that all the time in society, we do things that will result in the loss of life. However, there are higher values than just wearing the loss of life. And so ultimately, we have to have something that helps us determine what is this ordering of values, okay? Because obviously, at a certain point, if enough life was lost, if 80% of people that ever swam would start dying, then we would probably outlaw swimming, we wouldn't allow it at all, because that's too much death for the benefit and the pleasure that comes from swimming, right? Okay, so hopefully I've at least made that point that, yeah, there's this competition of values, and so we have to ask, who can make these determinations? One answer would be democracy. Democracy makes those determinations. As a body of people, we decide those kinds of decisions, okay? And that's true. I think that is a good fundamental answer for our society, is that we generally, through democratic processes, try to get these kinds of balances right of what our values are and what order they should have. And it's a pretty good system, because otherwise you have to rely on individuals and hope they can do it. But what about when we need fast action? Democracy is a slow process. Something like COVID coming on our society is a fast process, right? Here it is, and we've got to do something now, and there's no time to hold a democratic election to decide what to do about COVID. So you need people that can act about it. And one good example of this kind of situation is this guy right here to my left, I guess, on the camera, Abraham Lincoln, who I'm kind of holding here as the spirit of, you could say, this particular stream today, and you'll see why. When the Civil War erupted, if I remember right, even Congress was disbanded. They were not in session, and so decisions had to be made right then without the decision-making part of the more democratic part of the government. And so Abraham Lincoln had to make some very tough decisions about, basic civil rights and what things would be preserved and going to war and defense and all those things. There wasn't time for democracy at that moment, a fuller version of democracy. And he had to say, look, I'm making these decisions, but when Congress gets back, they can, through a more democratic process, kind of judge these decisions. And he did the best he could. So, what was it that we hoped that Abraham Lincoln would have in a moment like that? Where certainly something like a civil war is an equally momentous event as something like COVID, where you need fast action and you need somebody who can judge all sorts of competing values at once, okay? And, you've guessed it because it's in the very title of this whole thing, what you need in moments like that is something like, or exactly, wisdom, okay? And so, what is wisdom? How am I defining it here? Well, it definitely has something to do with being able to look across all these kinds of categories like I have today. And by the way, a little bit of farm chores are happening here around me. I've got this kind of more open mic, so if you're hearing something that sounds a little bit like mineral being poured out of bags to be put into containers to be taken to sheep, you would be exactly right. That is exactly what's happening here around me. So again, that's where we are, and that's kind of the environment around here, and that's the reality of these streams. But welcome to Mission Talk. Anyway, getting back to wisdom, definitely has to do with something with being able to look across all the categories, but also, but kind of as I tried to put a satisfying definition to it, I would say it's the ability to discern the relevant aspects of reality, okay? If at all times there's all these things going out in the world, you could categorize in many different ways. You have to discern what's relevant in there, in the world, in the cosmos, in reality, and then how to interact productively with reality in order to achieve your aims, I guess you could say. So another way of saying it is the ability to productively unify meaning with reality, okay? Because when you're taking meaning, something like we've talked about the union of heaven and earth, meaning is more the categories of ideas and principles, and unify it with actual facts and experience. Okay, you unify those productively so that it produces something. What? Good action, good results in the world, such that things go well in the world. Okay, and one more way to put it of how I'm using wisdom today is the ability to frame the world properly. Because again, there you get that you have the world. You can't grasp it all at once. Nobody can grasp all of reality at once. So what do you have to do? You have to frame it within a relevant framing that helps you then act successfully in the world. And so I would call that ability to frame the world and act successfully in it that is wisdom, okay? And you can see how wisdom is what's needed in one of these kind of situations, because it will help you to discern what to value in that moment, what to prioritize, what values are at stake. If you prioritize one value, what values are going to be left hurt, are going to be not honored, because sometimes you have to prioritize, and there will kind of be winners and losers in terms of values when there's such a momentous event as COVID, right? And so we ask, what discipline does this? What discipline can help, can train people or produce people or help you look at the world in such a way that you can have this wisdom in the time of something like COVID? Okay, very good question. Maybe some of you who's religious say, religion. My religion has given me the tools to operate successfully in the world, so it's my religious, framework in which I can do this. And others might say, it's politics. Politics, that's become the primary concern of our society right now. It wields the most influence and power, so by engaging in the process of politics, that will help people, and doing politics, that will help people produce the wisdom that you need. But hopefully, even in your mind, you begin to doubt, things like that. And you could do it with anything, economics, law, science, all these, again, have categorized the world in certain ways. Even religion these ways. Notice how people have categorized their religious life such that they have even their own way of talking about things in their religious circles. Generally, every religion kind of has its own vocabulary that is very hard for others outside of that religion to understand. And so, they have gotten used to looking the world within kind of a set of categories. Certainly, even my own faith tradition does this. And so it's a set of categories that doesn't make sense to other people outside of that categories. Okay, so that's one thing, is you can't even communicate it well. But then very often people have carved up their lives such that, their religious part of life is kind of for Sunday and the home and things like that. But then when you go to work, there's another set of categories that you need to be able to act on, economic categories and business strategy and whatnot. So even the religious leaders of the world, you haven't seen any of them kind of piping in and saying, okay, here's what we need to do in this time of COVID. The Pope hasn't attempted that, or any other religious leader that I've seen that's come in and say, hey, I'm the one that can look across all the categories and tell us, here's how we need to act in the time of COVID, okay? So hopefully we've kind of established that that's the state of affairs. We need something, like somebody that has wisdom, like a general knowledge about all these categories, right? Because if we produce all this knowledge in the world, we need somebody, or I should say, I'm not looking for one person. We should at least have a group of people or a lot of people that can look across the categories and see reality more for what it is, right? See reality as a whole rather than be able to just specialize in on the categories, so that when there's these generalizing events, these massive events that affect everything, there's at least somebody or a group of people that can have something like wisdom that reaches the level of a whole society in terms of today. And my argument is that is fundamentally absent and has been, and it's no more starkly illustrated than when we have an event like COVID. Okay, so that's kind of the first part of what I wanted to talk about today. I see, we've got some comments and things coming in, so I want to look at those real quick and just see what's on your mind, and then we'll move on, making a few more points in this. Okay. So I see you guys were all talking about my late entrance into the stream today. Again, I apologize. Took things too close to the wire today and then had to bear with setting things up. And of course, the streaming software had some automatic update that it was doing that I had to wait for and such. So thank you for your patience. I'm a person that values punctuality, so I'm very much violating one of my own values with this. So I thank you for being patient on these. And I'm hoping in the future to get more punctual. But then my fear now is that I'll get on there and be right there at 11 and nobody will be there because they don't actually think I'm going to show up on time. So I'll have to earn that trust back. All right, so Krishna says, I've never noticed the impressive thickness of Abraham Lincoln's individual beard hairs before. All right, yes, good observation. Martin says, if you say something stupid, they will ban you from YouTube. And yeah, that's exactly the stakes. I'm operating on kind of one of the principal platforms. And yeah, you say something stupid enough or not careful enough in what you say. Because I think there's generally always a way to say something respectively and carefully. And the fear is that when I'm talking off the cuff in a live stream, I'll say something in a way that comes off, not careful, not respectful. And then suddenly you find that something's been shut down or banned or whatever it is that happens today. So that's always a little bit of the fear and why, again, I was taking a little more time this morning. Okay, Superior Man says, in this information age where we have infinite information at our fingertips, having a filter and only paying attention to only important aspects is very essential. And yes, I fundamentally agree with that. In fact, one of the things I was doing kind of for a whole year along those lines that this is kind of turned into in the way that I'm always offering up books or things like that I found valuable is to have kind of it was a service, it was called Standing Stone, where I would send an email out each week giving recommendations of things that I found particularly relevant to understanding the world today. Out of all, the noise and all the information out there, here's things that I found were signal, that were actually helpful in helping people understand the world and not just create more confusion. And so in many ways, that's what I'm still trying to do with these streams is kind of pick out the best things I've found. And in the end, you'd say, well, who are you to do that? Who am I to do this? And you just have to judge if I have any ability to do it. But at the end of the day, I think it's individuals that we have to come to rely on much more today than these algorithms, for instance, that do not have your best interest at heart at all in the things that they're suggesting to you as being relevant, right? Which is, basically what all these platforms rely on today is this programmed algorithm, this artificial intelligence to tell people or suggest to people, hey, you might like this, this is important, which really is just, this might captivate you enough to keep this on this platform a little bit longer so we can make money off you in some way. So individuals is where I've turned my trust in, and especially, people that have proved themselves through kind of the cauldron of time in terms of good ideas. And that's why I'm predominantly, I recommend books that have kind of continued to show their relevance. But I still break out of books too all the time. Okay, so Martin Kuhn says, Fauci, wear 2 masks. And just another illustration of how the experts in these kinds of situations, they do what they're good at, right? They frame the world in the way that they've been taught to frame it. Okay, so we've identified then that we have fractured the world as a society, but that sometimes we need to be able to look at the world as a whole and across all these fractured ways that we've fractured it, and that being able to do that amounts to something like having wisdom, being able to frame the world properly, see the chunks of it that are relevant to what you want to accomplish, be able to discern what values should be principle and what shouldn't be. So it turns out, and then I was asking, what discipline, can produce this in people today? What university degree is focused on helping people to do just such a thing? And, in my mind at least, there's crickets going off because we haven't done it. Well, there was one discipline that was supposed to do this, that this was the main idea, okay? And that is the discipline of philosophy, okay? And this is what I studied during undergrad, and I remember being in my first introduction to philosophy class that I was just taking as part of the generals. It was before I had made that decision to go down this path of philosophy. And I remember being in there and they're saying, okay, philosophy. What does this word mean? And it's actually two words in one. Philia is the first part, which means love, a certain kind of love, a brotherly love or a friendship kind of love, a love of kind of liking something and having some sort of back and forth relationship with it. So that's philia. And then you have Sophia in it. Okay, and that means wisdom. Okay, it was Sophia, the name that's now used for various women, means wisdom. It was the Greek word for wisdom, and in fact, across the Greek conception into Hebrew conception, Christian conception, Sophia, wisdom, is personified as a woman. So very interesting in all of our discussions about the masculine and the feminine. So philosophy then amounts to essentially a friendship love with wisdom. And I really love that conception because I've thought about it, this being a feminine, figure, you could say, you don't get to possess wisdom. You can be friends with wisdom. You can have a back and forth relationship. But for example, Socrates, one of the first proponents of philosophy or philosophia, one of his claims to why he had maybe even any wisdom was that he knew that he was not wise, right? He did not possess wisdom because one does not possess it. You have a friendship with this. And there in undergrad, when I was presented with that, I'm like, oh, yes, that is what I want. Like, that's the degree that I want. And so I was in, and the rest is history. I took the philosophy degree and went down that path. And so now I am full of wisdom, right? And no, that's not how it works out. Because as it turns out, the discipline of philosophy, as I took, the first couple classes, I quickly learned that the whole discipline of philosophy had abandoned this kind of pursuit, this kind of love of wisdom as being the focus of things. Within a few hundred years, you could even say, but definitely by today, we're the last person you'd think of to kind of guide the whole society through something like COVID would be like a philosophy professor, right? As you kind of picture the disheveled, kind of brainiac, perhaps half drunk in his office with these brilliant ideas, but living up there in the clouds in the ivory tower, maybe being able to offer some practical advice and some, minute discipline of philosophy or something, and, maybe have their little impact to the world, but nothing like somebody that would be able to navigate and really offer guidance to a whole society and this broad way of values that we're talking about with something like COVID. So that just shows you that, philosophy as a discipline, as an academic discipline, had the exact same thing happen as everything else. It got categorized essentially to death, you could say, because when you start looking at it, to fracture something and have it dissolve away is the essential definition of death in almost every conception of death. Okay, so that's a hint of kind of the danger of going too far down the path of categorization. But returning back to what philosophy originally, the original idea was, okay, at the time of the original people that were calling themselves philosophers and whatnot, was that that was the pursuit, to have this friendship, love of wisdom. But of course now we've got way smarter than they were. Now we just say, let me put it this way. You ever heard of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle? Morons, right? That's kind of a little bit the way we see it. Of course not. But Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they were the primary ones that were espousing this version of a love of wisdom. And so what was that supposed to be? It was a pursuit of the good life. It was trying to look at the most important parts of life, including, the gods, including the developing ideas of science that were coming into the time, including drama, including stories, including everything, and trying to discern how to gather these all together in this process that allowed you to operate the most effectively, most in touch with reality, not so that you could live off in some, cloudy heavenly sphere, but so that you could operate effectively in the world, okay? And so Plato had an idea for the kind of people that would be needed to to do exactly what we've been talking about in this and operate across these categories, because they could exercise this type of wisdom, that unified meaning and the essential kind of elements of meaning, even the forms, of reality with actual reality itself, and be able to discern that thing. And so it would be this, to have somebody that had philosophia, that was a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, also coupled with the ability to rule, that became like the ultimate thing for Plato. And so he had a term for this, and it was a philosopher king. Okay? The combination of the ruler with this person that has this relationship, this friendship, love with wisdom. And so in the Republic, he had this vision of utopia that laid out a process that someone would go through in order to become a philosopher king. And it's a process that once you get into it, you could kind of quibble with in the kind of utopian society that he had in mind. I mean, for example, one thing was that it wasn't a democratic process that would select these people, and that would rub some of us wrong. So it's not the particulars of what he thought would give you this perfect philosopher king, but at least there was the conception, right? At least there was this idea that we need these kinds of people that could develop themselves across all the categories and ultimately end up as effective people for exactly the kinds of things that eventually erupt into society, whether it's wars, whether it's disease, things like that. And so there's even somebody that came fairly close to Plato's definition of what a philosopher king would be, and that was Marcus Aurelius, who has gotten a lot more attention today, especially by those who are interested in the Stoics, but just a lot of people interested in an approach to life today that has just a lot of practical wisdom. And so he's somebody I would very much encourage you to learn about. In fact, there's a lecture I should post down in the description after this, that is, if you search for something like the best lecture on Marcus Aurelius ever, or something like that, it will come up this kind of fairly old 90s lecture by this guy that gives this fantastic lecture on Marcus Aurelius and how it was so impressive that he was both the Roman emperor, but perhaps like the only ruler most people can think of that really came at least close to this ideal of being somebody that had both the ability to rule and exercise a significant amount of wisdom, both in his personal life, in his close relationships, but also at the level of an entire empire. So that's at least to say that something like this is possible. It has happened before, and it used to be something that was offered as a pursuit, something that people should develop in. Okay, but we ask the question, where are these philosopher kings in the time of COVID? Do they exist? Are they our Silicon Valley billionaires? Is it Elon Musk? Is it Bill Gates? Is it Jeff Bezos? They've made a lot of money. That's got to be kind of the clue of who the philosopher kings are today. Money has to be tied to wisdom, right? And the more you think about it, okay, maybe not. You start learning about the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world and things like, okay, these are decent guys. They have some skills. They made some money, and it took a lot of good attributes. But philosopher kings, the more you listen to them, the more you look at their personal lives, the more you look at, the broad range of categories of their lives, no, they come up as disappointing, right? So heads of religions, is that where we should find this? You'd like to think so. I'm a huge fan of religion. So shouldn't it be the heads of religion that can use those religious principles to look across that? And the interesting thing is that the heads of religion, they're not even trying, right? It's not a pursuit. Heads of religions today generally see themselves as being defined into their particular religion and those adherents of that religion, and they generally keep to the language and kind of bounds of that religion. So, I don't know, maybe they have that ability, but I don't see them quite exercising that, right? If it's anyone that we look to in the United States where we kind of assume this wisdom would lie, it would be the Supreme Court, right? We have this veneration for these elders. There's kind of the ritual nature, the robes, the respect that we've given to the Supreme Court. Certainly, they hopefully at least possess this wisdom in the Supreme Court. I've been, to the place where so many of them come from, Harvard Law School. I've rubbed shoulders with the nature of the education, with the people there. And there are incredibly smart people that go through the Ivy League and the places that get you to the Supreme Court. And there's brilliant people at the law firms and the places in government that do these things. But wisdom, is there more wisdom in a place like Harvard Law School? Well, at least my experience was that there's not. It has this value. And that's the danger of the Supreme Court, right? In effect, when they're making these pronouncements about the Constitution in ways that, there's not even in the text any guidance, what they have to rely on is their own wisdom. And you look at some of the most momentous decisions that have been given, and yes, effectively the Supreme Court, when you look at the text and what they're saying is saying, like, we are exercising wisdom for everyone. Well, the fact that you would have lawyers do that, I don't know. Again, I've rubbed shoulders with the kind of people that end up there, and it's like, again, brilliant people, good processing power and a certain way of thinking about the world, but it's a categorized way. I don't see why those should be the people that can exercise this kind of broad wisdom across categories. And, in general, that's how I see the Supreme Court. They're very good at what they've been trained to do, look at things legally. But I don't think they possess wisdom in this broad societal sense. And they should not be making decisions for a broad society that should better lie into the realm of wisdom. So my little rant on the Supreme Court. So is it academic professors? Again, brilliant people, skilled, capable, but they have not been trained to look across things like this. But on the other hand, that's where you see some of these people break out. And a lot of people start paying attention. Someone like Jordan Peterson, why do people find him interesting? Not because he's just focusing on psychology that he was trained in or had a clinical practice in, but because he's broaching over major topics, into religion, into mythology, into politics, things like that. That's why I love John Vervaeke, someone I brought up a lot. He had, deep training and spent many years in philosophical ideas, but at the same time, he's a cognitive scientist. So right there at the forefront on issues like consciousness and how the mind works. But at the same time, he practices a number of Eastern practices in meditation, knows very well his religions, Christianity, Buddhism, but also practices Tai Chi Chuan and this like. So when you get him talking about things, you get something much closer to wisdom because he's broaching over these broad categories. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't trust him to, run society for an issue like COVID, because there's an even broader range of things that you would need to kind of prepare yourself in to have that kind of wisdom. And so, at the end of the day, we're kind of left with politicians, right? That's where it ends up that these decisions have to be made. Politics is the level where we want the philosopher king to be. Like, that's where the philosopher king would still belong, because we've given so many powers and responsibilities over to the government, and the government, predominantly and almost exclusively uses force in order to accomplish everything it does. It uses the point of a gun to accomplish the things that it does. I'm not saying that there aren't legitimate uses of that power, but that's the way it affects things, and we've given it all these responsibilities. So today, more than ever, right, you would need somebody with the capabilities of philosopher king to know how to effectively or judiciously or wisely use that kind of power, especially in a time where you have the temptation to use it in ever-increasing ways, such as when a disease comes and you want to force people into behaving a certain way to accomplish the ends that you want, right? You need something very wise at the helm of things. And so you ask, does our political process, our process of elections and the kind of the vetting process in the media and elections, does that get us these philosopher kings today? And I know you're probably just sitting there laughing, because we all know that the way that elections proceed now, that wisdom is not the attribute that is being selected for as these elections proceed. And it's a shame, because that's where we need it most. But hence we get these politicians who, if we get somebody who has this kinds of philosopher king wisdom, we've been very lucky. And, it's always been like that to an extent. I mean, I've got Abraham Lincoln here next to me, again, to kind of embody maybe the closest thing the United States has ever gotten to somebody who operated with close to this level of wisdom in a perilous moment. You can criticize many things about Lincoln, and some people don't like him, but overall, he's probably the best thing we've got to a philosopher king. And we were very lucky, very fortunate, very blessed, you could say, to have had him at that moment in history. And now what have we done to him? Go look at where he sits there in Washington. He sits in a temple, and it says right there, temple. In this temple is enshrined in this temple is enshrined, as it is in the hearts of people, the spirit of Abraham Lincoln forever, something very close to that. So he's been made into a god of our kind of civic religion here in the United States, and in many ways rightly so. Okay, and I've gone to that temple and essentially worshipped. You can feel the power in that building, and they've done an extremely good job putting him up there in the exact same way on a throne like a Roman or Greek god would have been put in a temple. So here's just one of those ways that I'm hinting at in that I'm going to be talking about temples soon. Here's a very good example of how we all worship at temples and various different kinds. And yeah, I've worshipped at the temple of Abraham Lincoln and felt his presence there. And any of you who have ever been there can say the same thing. So how do we get more Abraham Lincolns? And it's actually very interesting to study his life and the process by which the range of things that he went through. He was out there in the frontier. He had very practical experiences in life, military, experiences just on a local level. He was like a postmaster there in his local place. He associated with normal people. He had to earn the affections of the people. He became a lawyer. He was known to have a brilliant mind, but also this practical, folksy mind. And he went through a tremendous amount of failures in his path to ultimately being elected the president. So you see at least something of how the people through it's not like he was aiming at becoming a philosopher king. People can still emerge in this world that have these abilities, but how do we then find them and get them into the places that we want them to be? And the stark truth is that today, we're not even trying to develop these people. There's no effort to develop these types of people. We could all have it in our minds. Like every parent would love their child to be developed like that, but then we encourage them to go into these specializations and kind of focus on that and make a lot of money and do this regular plan that we've got society in, which usually tries to get people to kind of compartmentalize their lives into the regular categories and kind of stay in those categories when they're in that domain. Be religious when it's time to be religious, go to work and do your little specialty there at work. But most parents are not trying to encourage their kids to look broadly across categories, read the classic texts, the sacred texts that have the most connection to wisdom, you could say, from the past. That's just it's not our focus, right? Most parents would like their kid to be like a really good athlete a lot more than they'd like them to be wise, per se. But this is definitely what I know some people want. This is what I was searching for in my personal education that I thought I would find in philosophy. I found some useful ideas, of course, useful way of thinking, but not nearly what I was looking for. Then I thought, oh, maybe law has it, because I see a lot of people like Abraham Lincoln who were lawyers. And so that might be the place where kind of, philosophy, or you could say, more rarefied ideas of meaning meet a practicality and join a society. And I quickly learned that, yes, law was not about finding the right thing to do. That's not what law is about. It's about, instead arguing, a case for a particular party or this or that. And it isn't, and really shouldn't, in the end of the day. You don't want judges, for example, trying to discern the right thing to do, because that requires wisdom, and they haven't been trained for it. The whole legal profession is not there to train wisdom. So ultimately, even in that legal education, I ended up fairly disappointed in it. And in the end of the day, you realize, okay, it doesn't exist. There is no discipline. There is no institution that is teaching this kind of thing. You have to pursue it yourself. And so yes, I am pursuing this. This is what turns me on. I love the idea of a philosopher king. Am I there? No, but at least that's the goal, right? And I can at least pursue this idea of this relationship with wisdom. Again, not this possession of it. I love that you have this relationship, this back and forth relationship. Philia suggests something like two people like each other, even. Whereas agape, you don't have to like someone to have agape for them, and how we've been talking about it. But philia, there's much more that sense of like, so that I love that thought of that you have this relationship with this feminine principle, this feminine spirit, wisdom, may be such that you can even like each other, right? Again, something to think about. So at least, though I've noticed, I'm not claiming to be a philosopher king, but the cool thing is that if you make that your pursuit, and that's going to be one of our practical kind of invitations out of this, is that you can at least be a philosopher king at your level of sovereignty, wherever that may be, of what you have sovereignty over. Hopefully yourself. You start always at that level of the self. You try to become the philosopher king of yourself. Not an easy task. We're all in that all of our life. Then you try to be it for a family. And another video that we're going to get into is the proper government of a family, what I think a proper government for a family should be, and I've already given it away. I think it should be a kingdom. Okay, so you can be a philosopher king along with your philosopher queen in your kingdom there with your family. And of course, you just go from there, and whatever you have the capacity and the capability to exercise that kind of sovereignty over. Okay. So let's get into the practicalities of this. So what do we do about this? Okay. So one thing is, I say politics is where these kinds of people are most needed, but they don't run. Okay, that's like the fundamental failing. If I'm condemning anyone in this podcast or this stream today, it's the people that have achieved something like a philosopher king status, because I know in the millions of people out there have to be some, and they don't run. They don't get into the fray, if you will. And you could say, no, maybe they do. The system doesn't allow them to get out there. I say perhaps, maybe they could never get up if they did run. But I've been involved enough in local politics, state politics, back in Utah to know that, no, these people are not there. And yet I see them. I see people that are much more close to being philosopher kings out in the communities, but they refuse to get in on this today. In a sense, they think they've either given up, or they think that they're kind of above it, if you will. And all I can say on that is that, sorry, but if that's your approach, you're going to get the world that you deserve, that you're building by not putting yourself into the fray. Okay, and of course you could say, easy to say because you're not doing it yourself. And it's like I've said, like I would love actually if I was at that level. That is the pursuit, but by my very own standards, I haven't lived up to that kind of level to get involved at that kind of level, because the kinds of things that I expect from this kind of person, and by the way, even under Plato's conception of it, like these these philosopher kings would dedicate decades and decades in this pursuit. And I think it was only when they're about in their 50s that they would then be allowed to start taking over the bigger realms of society. Of course, they would have had experiences along the way running things, but they needed some serious experience and study and stuff before they were allowed to do this. So I have not achieved those things. And what I would be looking for in somebody is that, again, across multiple domains, they have made life go well. So I'm looking just as much as that they could, run a company or a greater body of people as that they could run their own life, their own self, keep together a marriage across multiple decades, have their children not just go, end up rotten in ways that would seem to be connected to the parents, because of course you can't control everything that your children do and whatnot. And so that's the kind of person I'm looking for that has this kind of success over multiple domains of life. And again, I think they're out there. Like, take my state of Utah. There was the previous state of Utah where I was involved in politics. That's why I say it, because I am a proud Montanan now. But back there when I was a little more involved in politics, just on the the most minutest local level, you had 2 senators for the United States Senate, and I believe at the time there was 3 Congress people. Okay, so I have to believe that in a state of 3 million people, that there would be 5 people that would come close to this, right? But again, I never saw a single one person of that category ever even run for any of those types of positions. So that's where my condemnation lies, that these people just aren't getting into the fray, okay? Now, what should we do, okay, as people listening to this? Well, my invitation would be to you to recognize that this is a category of development, wisdom, and that it doesn't just happen, right? You have to actually pursue this friendship, love, this philosophia with wisdom and try to develop this. And that as you pursue it, generally put in your efforts, generally I think this relationship with wisdom can be developed and progressed in. But if no effort is given to it, then of course it will be maybe a random thing. Maybe you'll achieve some of it, maybe you won't. Okay, so that would be my first thing that I would experience or suggest with this. And then the second thing would be to find these kinds of people, look for them out there in society, and encourage them. Try to light a fire under them to get more involved in the fray, if you will, of this world. Because if not, the world just goes down burning because the people that had the wisdom, but maybe not the courage to get into the fray and use it, never showed up. And that's one of the kind of the sadder stories of the world, of what could happen in the world, that there were the people that could actually have made a difference and they stayed home, right? So that's the other practical thing I do. The last part of this, I want to get into maybe how, at least at my local level of sovereignty of myself and my family, would try to at least use what kind of philosophia relationship I had developed to influence the way we acted during COVID. But before I do that, I want to check back and just see what you guys have been saying here on the chat itself. Okay. So let's see. Wyss said, in the Utopia from Plato, but also in Camelot, King Arthur could be that philosopher king. Yeah, I definitely like the Arthurian legends. There's a lot of wisdom that could be pursued from those. One of the things is you get such different versions of the stories. You can kind of go different ways with the characters with someone like Arthur. But for sure, in many of them, that is the ideal, at least, that he's being held out as. And I'm sure you can glean some good stories, because so much oftentimes narrative is helpful in order to help you know how to develop. And the Arthurian legends are a good place for kind of developing your idea of the philosopher king. Martin Kuchen says, "Come on, King David." All right, so you could put him there. King David. I guess I'll say I have not devoted the time yet to his life to really have a lot to say about it, because it's so complex. And one thing I know, like I've heard Jonathan Pageau's brother or something might be writing a book just on King David, because yeah, he's a tricky figure. He's kind of all over the place in there. And I have kind of the interest of really diving in and understanding King David more. And of course, I know the basic story, but I can just tell that I'm barely skimming the surface. So I don't have much to say about King David yet. Superior Man says Marcus Aurelius's book Meditations is a great Stoic book. It's amazing how an emperor could also be a great writer. Yeah, so thank you for that recommendation. Like if you guys are interested in Marcus Aurelius, what I would do, go watch that lecture I mentioned. And again, I'll try to remember to put the link down below, or just on YouTube, Google like best lecture on Marcus Aurelius. And it'll come up with this guy, kind of 90s looking video with kind of curly hair, I think kind of tighter curly hair. He's a pretty good lecturer, and it's a really good read, great to listen to in the car or something like that. And then after that, then I would get the Meditations, because that's probably the best next step in learning more about Marcus Aurelius. Okay, Christian, don't you think philosopher kings would never be elected in the popular contest of democracy with universal suffrage? Yeah, perhaps. So that's where I have to say that maybe one reason these types of people don't even put in is because they have the wisdom to know that, they would just get beat up. They wouldn't make it into these positions. And so I think that's something that should be recognized. But, you'd think you'd see at least a little bit more of an effort. Maybe I missed it. Maybe that happened decades ago, and these people kind of realized that they could never have that type of impact. And I should say, it's not like I think, for example, the fundamental problems of the world today, I actually don't think are solved at the political level, especially not through political solutions where you're like government programs and things like that. But even that being the case, it would be awfully nice to have a more philosopher king type person in there, because they would realize the limitations of government, and they could use, kind of that mouthpiece to also put out there the right principles out into, the realm of ideas at a much more effective level than ones when they have to kind of bubble up from beneath. Not that I think that's not also effective. So yeah, there's a good point there that even if these people were trying, it's not to say they would actually get put there in a world such as ours today. Ed says, isn't it a fundamental characteristic of the people you view as worthy is that they are self-examining and have doubts? They may not feel worthy rather than cowardice. So yes, I mean, that is very much the case. Again, reminds me of that fundamental stance of Socrates of being mystified why the Oracle of Delphi would call him wise when he knew that he was not wise. But in the end of the day, he did have to reach that conclusion. Oh, maybe I am wise in this very thing that I know that I am not wise. And of course, that was the whole stance of Socrates, and that he's always trying to pull out from people, get people to realize kind of what they don't know, and open up that new space of possibility, have an aporia in themselves, where they realize that there's this new realm, undiscovered, realm that they didn't know about, missing in their progress, you could say. So yes, I think that's appreciation. But at the end of the day, if like another way of framing this is people are trying to be more godly, right? And I'm not saying they're trying to be gods, but they're trying to be godly. And in being godly, eventually you have to reach kind of an attribute where you can see things from that perspective, where you recognize even in yourself, oh, I do have it at this certain level. Even though I'm willing to criticize myself, I have reached this level where I need to get in there because nobody else is, So I kind of go both ways with that, right? Martin says, if we who are not philosopher kings want to encourage philosopher kings alike to run for office, isn't it folly per definition, as they have more wisdom than we? Yes, but of course, these people aren't perfect either. And kind of like you said, that they're still human. And so when people encourage you to do things, I think even a lot of the people that have probably been the best presidents or things like that probably wouldn't run unless people came to them and said, hey, we have this group of people, we think you're the person to do this. There's something about that again, lights that fire underneath somebody that maybe they need. Because even being wise, they may they may need a little fire lit underneath them, right? Sebastian Brun. And I'm seeing some new names here. Again, always happy to see new names participating. Always welcome to anybody that's there that wants to kind of jump in and participate. Anybody's welcome to do it. So thank you for all the meaningful content. You're welcome. Yeah, I greatly enjoy this and the exchange in this. That's one way I can always tell if it's going well, is if it seems like I'm learning and enjoying this and growing at the same time that others are perhaps benefiting and learning and growing at the same time. Christian, Gary, have you ever read When Breath Becomes Air? The writer of that book was really searching for wisdom across a range of domains and then decided to be a surgeon to learn about life and death. No, I haven't. So I will give it a look. Christian, Solomon immediately comes to mind ahead of David as a philosopher king. Okay, good point. Yeah, and again, even in Solomon, kind of that realm of the Hebrew Bible, I wish I had spent more time on to be able to say anything productive about it, but I haven't as of yet, other than just kind of surface knowing the stories. With Seneca as the final boss of Stoicism. Yeah, you could say Stoicism is actually a good discipline. It's definitely been growing in popularity today as people are searching for some established kind of realms of wisdom, you could say, associated with wisdom that have an actual structure, practices, a tradition, texts, etc. So it's not just Marcus Aurelius that was known. It's not like he was the only person known as a Stoic. There's many figures, and Wiss points out that Seneca was one of them. Okay, Arnie, have you ever read through any of Bruce Lee's works? Also, thank you for this series. No, I haven't. Bruce Lee is someone I haven't also looked into yet. But again, I'm always thankful for the suggestions, because that's kind of one thing I realized in this process, that if I don't continue to delve into new ideas, new perspectives, then at some point, whatever I'm saying is going to become stale and not worth listening to. So I'm always open to these kind of suggestions. Maybe that's the first time I've seen your name too. So welcome if this is your first time participating, or if I haven't noticed you before. And Ratha, did you get my husband's email? He hosts Honey Badger Radio. It'd be cool to hear you come on and talk about masculinity in movies. I did get that. Yeah, so thank you for being on. And I think I responded last night. Hopefully it got there. If it didn't, have them send me another email, because I responded, and technology, always wondering if things work, but it should be there by now. So yeah, I'd be happy to talk with you. So thanks for that invitation. Ed, understood. That's a good point. Abhi Sharma, how about Hammurabi as a philosopher king? Perhaps, again, just someone I don't have as much like in-depth knowledge. These are all names of people that I know, but just not enough to offer a good judgment. But now that you've mentioned it, I'll pay more attention. Enrique Pereira, great tonic greetings from Brazil. Oh, thank you. Yeah, my only time I've ever been to Brazil was just the airport in Sao Paulo on my way to Uruguay, where I spent 2 years, but was never much there near the border. So as of yet, I would very much love to go to Brazil and get to know it better, but welcome, Enrique. And then Abhi Sharma, could he be considered? Okay, so about Hammurabi. Again, yeah, I mean, probably in the sense that the very fact that we're talking about him these days in a positive light. I mean, if the thing that he's known for, of course, I would assume would be the Code of Hammurabi, some of the first laws, and when you I guess, conceive of what it takes to do some of these things for the first time or the beginning times, the kind of practical wisdom it takes to see how these new ideas that we now just take for granted, like a codified system of laws, the fact that those might have been associated even partly with an individual shows that, yeah, probably they did hold incredible capacity, and that's why we're still talking about them today. Okay, so yeah, always enjoyable to talk with you a bit on the chat. I'm gonna end up wrapping up just with some thoughts about my own experience with COVID. Just so you can see, again, I'm never trying to hold myself out as some sort of example or like I'm a good person or thing like that. But let's just say, like, this was my experience as a person who tries at least to have this kind of relationship with wisdom, and tries to use it in the domains I have sovereignty and authority over, like my own life and like my family. This was my experience with COVID in what happened. So for what it's worth, right? If you don't find value in it, that's always fine with me. Or if you think that it wasn't wise, well, then know that, yeah, it's a process. I'm always just in a process like anybody else. But my experience with it was, my family had gotten back from a year of travel in Europe around December 2019. And so we were hanging around looking for, we definitely were, we had expanded out into the corners of our house there. And so we were looking for a new place to live in the first few months of 2020, when we started seeing the news stories about COVID happening over there in China. And so I started paying attention, because, that's one thing you learn if you're always trying to look across all the categories, is what to pay attention to. And that immediately was like, pay attention to that and see how it develops. And within a few days, you could see, okay, it's there, it's growing. And very quickly it was, okay, there's already a case here in Seattle or something in the United States. And right there, at least to me, from my experience in the world and just, trying to have this kind of relationship, it was obvious that it was going to be here, right? And so you looked, what's happening there in Asia as they experience it. And already you could see a pattern, right? This is going to affect society in a general way. It's probably going to make society shut down in a way. How long? Unknown at that time. But also there was already encouraging news, like, there is not, it's not 10% or 20% or 50% of the population that's dying from this. It appears to be something like 3% or lower. So it's like, okay, this could be big in its effect, but at least, we're not talking about something that's going to wipe out humanity as we know it, probably. And so saw that, that's what you could see already. And so what I did was I said, well, let's prepare then, at least at our level that we have sovereignty over, for the best and the worst case scenario. Best case scenario, nothing happens, and we don't have to do much preparation for that at all. Worst case scenario, society itself could fall apart, right? And why would I say that? Because already when you see people having to, stay at home and these kind of lockdown situations that happen, and if you're paying attention to the world, you'll know that, that disrupts. And once things get disrupted, more things can get disrupted. And when you consider the fact that already prior to 2020, the world, if one way I kind of think of the world is this vast, like, spider web network of things. And if you already could see that, so many things in the world were hanging on by very tenuous threads, kind of holding together society. And then you see this possible thing coming, you're like, this could be nothing, or it could bring it all down, right? And so what did we do? We went and hit and first made sure we had some food for the next several months. And in my religious tradition, we're actually encouraged to already have this. So we already had a lot of it. But I was there at Costco, this big warehouse store in the United States, like weeks before there was any lines, because you could already see what was coming, right? And so I'm there, like, loading up with all these things and grain and stuff like that. And I was looking the crazy person, right? Because it's like, people are just like, what is this guy up to? Is he, servicing a restaurant or something like that? Anyway, we got everything we needed. And for at least several months of that, just because I'm like, who knows what could happen here? And the next thing was, I said, okay, again, worst case scenario, society itself could fracture and fray on this because of looking at the world. That's at least a possibility. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's within a reasonable level of possibility. So what else should we do? We should be prepared that, maybe we'd have to indefinitely live away from our home in case we ever had to move, in case there wasn't resources where we were at. We had to live. So I started collecting the kind of gear, which was mostly kind of backpacking type gear, so that my entire family of 8 children and myself could live indefinitely outside of our home. And it was fun, really. I mean, it was like I was doing it because it was like, hey, this is a good practice. This is good because guess what? We like to backpack. So if we were like got everything that we need to, not only will we be able to, live indefinitely away, but we'd also be able to weather this, or we'd also be able to start taking some fun backpacking trips with more members of the family. So I started doing that. And yes, of course, that required money and things like that. I'm not saying that everybody can take these kind of things, but that's at least my thought process. I have sovereignty over this. I have room to act. I can act. I can see what's coming. All right. And so you start doing that kind of thing. So then finally the virus hits, and then, the craziness hits, right? The lines just out the door at Costco and the toilet paper disappearing and all that. And I'm just sitting there just being like, was this really that hard to see what was going to happen, at least at that level, that people needed to have some sort of backup? And it's so funny because, again, in my religious tradition, which there in Utah is the predominant society, people are trained in this. They're told to do this. And yet, the giant lines at Costco and everybody panicking and the empty shelves and all that. So anyway, the interesting thing was, it was very quickly after that, okay, the virus is hit, you start seeing people get sick, but there in my own my own state, I could very easily see, it turns out, it's not even 3% of the people that are dying, certainly not healthy people. You could already see there within the first couple of weeks that it starts hitting in your society. You could observe around you. It's not even a matter of statistics coming from the news or anything like that. You could just observe. This is not, plenty of people are getting sick, but the healthy are getting over it. And it's generally the people that are already sick, or have some sort of, proclivity to sickness. They're the ones dying. So, immediately there's the solution right there. What do you need to do? You need to protect those that are close to death or needing help in order to preserve their health, but the regular people don't need to at all. So my family, essentially defied any of the initial kind of things, because at that point, if you remember, masks were just becoming an idea and things like that. But we didn't stay away from anyone or anything. We got together with friends that were kind of like-minded, and we kind of made sure that this virus, passed through us, and we're very confident it did in those early months, such that, a strange little sickness, light sickness, passed through most of the family, a little bit more serious than others, and that included a loss of smell and this or that, and boom, it was done, because it's like I was looking at the odds and saying, I'm comfortable with this, right? And from that point on, we're sitting there saying, okay, at least as far as our family, we're kind of done with this process of this disease. We're just going to move on with our lives. But of course, that's right when, the masks and the lockdowns and everything really started being clamped down. And so there you have to make a decision. And you realize, okay, yeah, I am not up at the level of sovereignty of running this whole show. Neither am I likely to be anytime in the near future. So you have to do one thing that the Stoics are very good at and say, what do I have control over and what don't I have control over? And you think really long and hard about that, right? Because I could see, I don't have control over whether when I go in a supermarket, I'm going to wear a mask or not. I can decide not to go to the supermarket or that, but I'm not going to control the supermarket either, or even at this point in an effective way like my elected officials or things like that. But on the other hand, what could I do with my life such that I don't have to live like this, in this way that, I'm very much a person that does not want to be constricted as to autonomy. So my sons and I, you can even see the videos, we started just going out into the wilderness and having a great old time in the wilderness, beautiful wilderness of Utah, and taking these trips. And that was kind of one of our initial actions right there, when even these the national parks were shut down and things like that. But that's the beautiful part of the wilderness areas that are still in the United States. You can't just shut down a wilderness, and so people can go out and get out into it. And so we did. We used the autonomy that was still available for us. And as things wore on, and I could tell, this isn't going to go away. The initial idea was, let's slow the flow of this disease progressing. So everybody kind of lock themselves down and avoid social situations and stuff. Very quickly you start saying, this isn't going to end. right? You could see the clues. If you look out there and you're good at kind of looking out across the domains and getting the signals, it's pretty obvious. And so that's where the point I started saying, okay, we were already looking for a new place to live. Let's really look for a new place to live, somewhere where we can exert and use the kind of, preserve the kind of autonomy and sovereignty that we want to over the part of our life that we have a right to have that kind of sovereignty over, right? And that's our personal life. And so, long story short, you've already heard the story from there. We eventually made it here to Montana in this setting where, at least for now, we have a pretty nice balance between having community and people around us, because we do love people and community, but also have kind of the space and the possibility to live as we please, even in this time that COVID was going on. And as we see, as we should all be not a little bit, but have quite a bit of trepidation about, we can see that a lot of the controls of government that have been kind of put into effect and accepted by society, those things don't easily go away. So we shouldn't be surprised when new things happen out in society, that there's also equal levels of control coming from the government. And I want to live in a situation where I don't have to deal with that, So, that's just my little story of how everybody's situation is different. Yes, some of these things require money. Yes, maybe you live in an area where there is no wilderness left. You couldn't have done that. So everybody has a different scenario of what kind of possibilities are still left to them. I think my only suggestion out of all this was that all of us can look at the ways in which we can't control things, and be wise, have to have that philosophia, that level of wisdom with what we can't control and accept that, but also that level of philosophia in what we can control and what we can exercise our sovereignty about, and quit the complaining so much as just acting out in the world as we can. And you generally feel a lot better when you start finding those areas of sovereignty and then using them, right? I've been over this a little bit before, and I don't want this to go on like super long, so I'm just going to barely jump over this, but I'll offer just a few more thoughts on kind of the overall broader societal assessment of how COVID has gone. Again, my purpose is not to condemn and to make people mad, but merely put out their ideas of how this could have gone, in the bigger picture. And so, and show how that maybe if there was a little bit more development of this idea of trying to help people develop into wisdom, we would have had some people that could have seen these kinds of things, if I'm right, which I am always willing to say I might be completely wrong in some of these ideas. So I am a person that respects life, but as I've explained before, I'm also a person that sees that there are more important values than life itself. And the very way that we run society shows that. For example, we're willing to fight in wars in which many young people would die. Why? To preserve values that are even more important than those young people's lives. And one thing I've thought about is that, if there was some society controlling that had come in and conquered my society, the only thing they said was, we are going to be generous conquerors of your society. We're going to keep controlling things. We'll let you kind of live your lives. However, we are going to require you to wear masks in these kinds of scenarios. You need to space yourselves out in this kind of distances. You need to, and in general, the other restrictions that have been given in the time of COVID. If there was that scenario, I would be part of the resistance movement against trying to cast that force off of us. Again, let me make something abundant and clear, for the possible YouTube censors and stuff like that. I'm not suggesting that that's what people should do, because this is not a scenario on which a conqueror, came in. We have a democratic society. We can affect changes through democracy, and I very much, preference those. But all I'm trying to say is that we so easily give up these privileges in society, these kinds of movements and things, in the name of preserving life. And yet, if it was a slightly different scenario, with this force coming from a different force and imposing these restrictions, like a conquering nation or something, I would be willing to give up my life to fight for freedoms such as these, to see somebody else's smile, to embrace somebody as I saw fit, right? And to make those kinds of judgments for myself. So these are the kind of things that we're like, I don't think we properly value certain things as compared to life. For some reason, our society, and I think it's because of our scientific bent, we have moved into a scenario where we can only see this one value, like, preserve life. Don't let people get a disease, because it seems scientific that, right? But we've lost these other considerations. Like, again, what is the value? How many lives are worth the value of 1 million people embracing once a day, right? I mean, that's a real question. How could you get the answer to that? Well, you'd have to have discernment. You'd have to have wisdom, What's the value of people smiling at each other, seeing people's teeth in an interaction over a drugstore counter, times the millions of interactions? Well, again, you might say, oh, not much. But in fact, that might be the glue that holds together a society and causes that society not to fall apart and, tons of lives to be lost in that process of society falling apart or bringing upon conflict or war or something like that. So these are the things that just aren't considered. A person that's looking at this from a, disease type scenario is not taking into account those types of values, right? And I'm not saying I've got it all figured out, it should have gone exactly this way, but those values aren't even taken into account. Okay, how about the value of transitioning from this life to any next one, or ending this life in the context of meaning, right? Essentially, people in our society the ability was taken away from them to have their life end in a context of meaning, surrounded by loved ones, in a spiritual context or a ritual context, right? That gave them that transition out of this life in some way that meant something. Instead of being isolated from family members. So I'm talking specifically about all these people that have died in these nursing homes, not even being able to have funerals or people around them as they died because of these restrictions. And what's the value of that? Is it worth some people dying in society? Even a lot of people dying in society? Maybe. But again, we don't even take that I don't think that's even taken into consideration. And so these are the types of things that I'm putting out there would be a little bit different if we had this broader conception of what to do in this kind of situation. At the end of the day, I think it would have been the best scenario to take those people that wanted at every expense to preserve their life, or those that were close to death, and exert the tremendous resources, or put in the tremendous resources and money that would have taken to protect them. And it could have been done. I mean, heck, we did it for NBA stars. I'm sure at the cost of millions in the NBA bubble, and it worked. It would probably take tremendous resources, billions of dollars, maybe even trillions. But guess what? We spent trillions in all these other efforts, that have included shutting things down for everyone. Because here's the other thing, like, there are so many of us that could have just carried on in life in the ways that regularly are productive in society, and maybe even grown and made society better by the fact that we probably would have been more disposed to serve those that needed to be protected, needed to be isolated. And I think humans are pretty caring when it comes down to it. So instead of wearing masks, as the thing that cares about others, maybe we could have had the messages being focused on help those that must isolate, right? And I think many millions of people would have done that, and it would have preserved the freedom for those who didn't want to wear a mask, who wanted to live out their regular life, to have the freedom to do so. And again, there's also, you can bring in all sorts of things. Oh, that would have overwhelmed the system, the hospitals. If you got sick, you wouldn't have been able to go to the hospital and be taken care of. You might have died and stuff. And so here's one more thing that I'll show in. Guess what? We allow people to take those kinds of risks all the time in society. We allow people to jump off of squirrel suits, off of mountains, in order to have a thrill, and many of them die, in the process, but they're still allowed to, because they're allowed to take on that kind of risk, make those kind of value judgments for themselves. So I very much think we should allow people to make the kind of value judgment of, if the possibility that their local hospital, could be filled to capacity. If they got sick, they would not be able to be helped. But a lot of people, seeing that they were a healthy person, and the odds, the 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million odds that they, as a certain kind of person, would end up with dying from this sickness or whatever, that should be in the prerogative of people to do, and they can continue on being, productive rather than just being shut down and isolated. Okay, so yeah, at the end of the day, if it was anything, I would hope that even would be considered from this point on, it would be to say, like, we need to bring in the greater valuing of things like social interactions, like embraces, like smiles, like religious communities being able to come together into a context of communion, if they so well please, right? Those things are valuable. They produce tangible things in the world, and they can't just be cast aside as if they don't matter. And again, somebody has to make these judgments, but the funny thing is, the way that those judgments have been made has been, the most disappointing process, because it's left to experts that have no domain for making those kinds of value judgments. That's the last thing I want to say about that. And in the end, I kind of hold out. Here's an image that I think is a powerful image to kind of end with. In the course of looking for this, I found this image, and this is a icon that's used probably in the Eastern Orthodox Church, maybe the Catholic Church, probably the Eastern Orthodox Church, of Sophia, which is the bigger figure, and then her 3 daughters, Faith, Hope, and Charity. Okay, so what's very cool about this is this actually comes from a story from real people. There was this woman named Sophia, and she ended up being a Christian martyr. And then she had 3 daughters, and they were named Faith, Hope, and Charity, and they were also Christian martyrs. So in that sense, you say, oh, it's just kind of happenstance that these were named after these virtues, you could say, and whatnot. But that's not how the world works, There wouldn't be an icon made like this, with a structure like this, with Sophia being this greater figure, and her daughters being Faith, Hope, and Charity. And people wouldn't have paid attention to this story if it didn't have a context of meaning to it. So, if you value faith, hope, and charity, you can kind of see from the structure of this grander, the way that faith, hope, and charity even, these core virtues that not just the Christian world values, but have become, in as much as we are still structurally a Judeo-Christian society, especially in the United States, these values come out of Sophia, have emerged, have been birthed from Sophia. So I'll end on that to contemplate. And I think one more thing I should say is, that I think essentially the answer comes in this relationship that we have to reestablish with the feminine. One more thing I wanted to poke in here. Anybody who's been here a lot has known that I've paid attention to a lot of these stories lately that have the missing kind of motherly feminine figure. And here's one more place where, lo and behold, in our world today, we're missing wisdom. And it turns out wisdom is this motherly, feminine spirit, you could say. So tied into this greater vision or something we've been kind of developing here, of showing that this feminine spirit has been missing. And a large part of our task of those who see something like a better world is to see this spirit out there in the world today, and not just see it, but develop a relationship with it. So that's the last of what I wanted to say today. Okay, I am eager to see what you guys had to say about that. And so we'll get through that. But anybody who has to go, this is the last I'm saying of kind of any of the ideas I wanted to put out there today. And as always, I'm happy to stay here chatting with you till we kind of exhaust everybody's thoughts for the day. Okay, let me see. I'm going back to try to find where we left off. Okay. Ami, I found this work relating well to my own introverted personality. It had an interesting similarity to Stoicism in a way. New to a stream, but I've listened to your series while I clean at clients. Yeah, and I'm glad you've seen that connection, because Stoicism, well, I've never dived into it like with a real focused attempt at comprehensively kind of either practicing Stoicism or understanding it. I've definitely encountered it again and again, and it's been extremely useful to me. There's a lot of powerful ideas that come from Stoicism that I've found just kind of naturally fit in with the way that I like looking at the world. There's this idea out of this lecture that's a very powerful and kind of intimidating idea, I guess you could say, that Marcus Aurelius would say that as you kiss your children to bed every night, you need to say to yourself in your mind, that they could die during the night. You have to be prepared for that. And that's because the reality is, it's completely true. You have to see what's in control, that you have control over in the world, and what you don't. And every time you buckle up your kid in the American Deathmobiles and ride on our roads and things like that, you could be 1 second away from never seeing those children alive in this life again. And so you have to accept that, right? And actually, thank you for bringing that up, because that ties in one more thing too that I really wanted to bring up, and I brought up before about this whole COVID thing. This has exposed the fact that our society, at the one time we're trying to preserve life at all costs because we don't realize the other values, we are mortified. That of course that's where we are afraid of death, right? Even people that I've seen that have a conception of an afterlife, one that says that that's a better place than here, actually, any way you look at it, I've seen have been very afraid of dying during this time. And so that's again where, if we had our values better together, if we had better judgment, we would say, I think there would be okay, let me put it this way. There should have been the freedom for those people that see death like that want to approach it forthrightly. They want to approach it the right way, which is to say death is inevitable. There would be a lot of people that would recognize and have their wits about them to say, I am close to death, right? And I would rather die in a context of meaning, surrounded by my loved ones, than be isolated from them. And I should have that kind of privilege. That should have been something that was encouraged, of people. So I'm not saying this isn't euthanasia or anything like this, but people that would say, I'm willing to face this disease and the possibility that it could end my life. But hey, I'm ready to face that possibility forthrightly. But again, that's not how we acted at all as a society. And so many people were almost encouraged to act afraid about death because we have this horrible relationship to it, which Stoicism, by the way, is one of the best approaches to death. It teaches death is an inevitability. We have to realize that we have to confront it. It is one of those parts that we don't have control over ever facing it. It will come, right? It will come with us. It will come with our children. It could come to anybody at any time. So that just shows that how these ideas are so powerful and how they're a big help. I love bringing in ideas from any tradition that are helpful in that way. Okay, so Christian, I was also way more worried about the virus before people cared at all, and now that everybody's worried, I'm not. I actually don't. It doesn't actually feel good to be ahead in that regard. It's frustrating. Yeah, it is, because it's like when you see that there was a better path and then it wasn't that. That's the most frustrating thing at all, right? When you know that it could have been different, that this could have been a good story. Put it that way. I'm always talking about living in a good story. When you see that there was so much better of a story that it could come out of this, a courageous story, a story that could get chronicled into the ages, that would motivate and move our posterity to something better. But instead, it was a story full of conflict and fear and control and a lack of wisdom, a sacrificing of greater values for lesser one, it's a story about a unveiling, you could say, an exposure of the fact that our society doesn't have mechanisms for properly placing values. And so, not a good story, right? And it could have been a good one. Okay, Ratha, I agree. Preserve life by not living or coming together to mourn at a funeral, 6 feet apart in masks at funerals. There's these things that people should have the ability to make their choices of what's more important or not, whether it's spreading a disease or communing with their posterity or their ancestors or their loved ones. And again, that's not to say that people shouldn't also have the right to, isolate themselves and avoid a disease. So that's one thing I should say. When I was looking at this disease and trying to assess it, if it had been 5% of the population or 10% of a healthy population dying from this, I'd have been, okay, that's it. I am finding the way to have no contact with anyone. I would have, absolutely isolated myself because I don't want, 1 out of 10 of my children to die from this. So again, we have to preserve people the ability to make those kinds of determinations and exercise that autonomy for themselves. At the same time, I'm the first advocate of helping others in that process, being concerned with others, showing that agapic love to others. And so it's this balance of the two. And it seems like we got, there was a concern for others in this. You can praise people for wearing masks because they're saying, this is how I'm being good to others and I'm caring about others. There's something to it. You got to give that its honor. But again, it's wisdom that allows you to zoom out and say there was better ways of showing care for each other and respect for each other and honoring humanity, right? Okay. Superior man, give me freedom or give me death. Patrick Henry. Yeah, there are some things that are more important than death. Christian Nemo, Gary is fermenting rebellion. YouTube censors. I am not. But anyway, Martin Kook and Gary, don't you believe that this whole ordeal is orchestrated by the elites? Personally, I don't have enough information to suggest that that's the case. What I will say is that people do have motivations. The elites, there are certain people that want certain things to happen in society, and seeing that this was happening was a very good opportunity to exert programs, controls that certain people have as their vision of a better society. I don't generally think there's, kind of conspiracies of human beings per se with like malicious intentions like you'd see like in a James Bond movie, plotting and things like that. I don't think that's generally how it works, but I do think that some people have, their visions of what would be better that are mistaken oftentimes, and then they see opportunities in which to implement them, and they take advantage of those opportunities. So that's a little bit more the way that I would say how the elites act in this. At the same time, I am more and more the believer of kind of spiritual entities out in the world that do have more malicious intent and work upon people and, get a hold of people, you could say, that, people think they're having their own ideas and they're just, autonomous, free-thinking people, but they have been taken over by a greater kind of spiritual principality or power, you could say, which really dictates more what they think than something else. And you can explain those through different means, spiritual means, psychological means, but the fact that there are these kind of collective bodies of thought that can move across peoples and influence them in ways that they completely don't realize, I think is, unmistakable. And you just have to point out the Nazi regime and the communist regimes as the quintessential examples of how, ideas can completely take over people, even people that had good intentions and whatnot. So those are the kind of things I watch out for more, are those kind of more spiritual nature kind of beings that I see working out there on the world. Of course, there are evil people out there, but I tend to find there are not that many in terms of people that like say, I know that I am actively trying to hurt other people. I think there's very few people like that. It's generally that they're working in the service of some other body of ideas that they don't know that they're in the service of. That's the way I think it generally happens. Okay, Martin says, Jordan Peterson said in his 12 Rules of Life that people don't believe the little lies, but they believe the big lies. World War II was started by a lie, Hitler said. Poland attacked Germany. Yeah, I mean, one more thing I'll kind of in that vein that I'll say is just to take notice that any of these things that exert more control over people or take over their autonomy or things are always done in the name of the good of everyone. And that's how they're always sold, right? And so anytime anybody's, selling anything really by advocating that this is going to be good for you, so accept this, that always makes my little certain kind of bone in me tingle somewhere that says, pay attention to what, really might be happening here. And that's certainly been the case during COVID, right? Okay, Christian. In the UK, they're discussing preventing people from going into shops and restaurants without evidence being vaccinated, wondering what happened to the previously unquestioned bodily autonomy. Again, those are the things that like most concern me. Because again, from the very beginning, you could see that was a possibility, that pretty soon you have to be essentially carrying your papers. You have to have the right clearances, right papers in order to do anything, right? Whether it's a ID on your phone, whether it's, you have to have the right identifying marks to you to participate in society. And those are the kinds of things that just like, those are the kind of things I would be willing to get out there, speak out about, eventually do what it took to say that these kinds of things are fundamentally wrong, the kinds of things that make a society unworkable, unbearable. So if those kind of things get implemented where I am, that's when I will, leave my little hamlet here and get to work saying like, no, I will not tolerate it, right? In the most, peaceful and legal means possible for what's happening, of course. Okay, Martin says signs of our times. Christian, I don't know global elites made COVID. I just think they poorly handled it. Time will tell. Gary, great thoughts on spiritual conspiracy. I think you'd love the Screw Tape Letters if you haven't read it already. It only takes a few hours to read. Yeah, I have read it. In fact, that was a good read. I read it, though, like 20 years ago, so I could definitely use a refresher on that. Okay, as usual, I kind of hoped this would be like a half an hour presentation, and here we are closing in on 2 hours. So I think we've covered this pretty well. It's another one of those that I'd love to see packaged in a better video. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. As things occur in my life, most likely it won't. But at least it will stay up in its present form for what it's worth. And as I've committed this week, my efforts this week are focused on getting this on the waterfront video out. Was able to make some progress yesterday, and I'm going to be mainly focusing on that. So if the streams from this point on do manage to be a little bit shorter and pithier to a point, you'll know that it's because it's in the service of trying to actually get one of these polished pieces out by the end of the week, as I've committed to do. So thank you for being here, everyone that's here. Always good to be with you, even in this virtual setting, which has its own frustrations, but it's much better than nothing. And thank you for your comments, your thoughts. Your comments on the videos have been still successful being able to reply to those. Any emails, I welcome them. Yes, this is Gary then signing off from Mission Top, and I'll be back tomorrow, same time.